But perhaps the greatest positive thing that may hopefully come out of this transformation is the creation of entirely new companies and new ways of looking at transportation. And one of those is certainly Better Place. So we're very fortunate to have Michael Granoff to talk about Better Place and also, I guess, more generally about the auto industry. Michael is head of oil independence policies for the company. Better Place is a Palo Alto-based firm that, as I mentioned, has operations in different countries around the world. Michael is also the founder of Maniv Energy Capital, and I believe that Maniv was one of the founding investors in Better Place. So look forward to hearing about what Better Place is up to. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. One of the things Michael didn't mention is that I also have been associated with NDN since its creation in '96, yes. And I've always enjoyed that association because I really find that it promotes pragmatic and real solutions and tries to separate out the politics as much as possible and accomplish things. So it's always a pleasure to be able to talk to an NDN audience. Few things. First of all, there are two separate problems here when you talk about cars and so-called energy independence. And too often they're conflated. They're both problems and they both have solutions, and the solutions are very related. But we should separate them out. And that is to say that we don't have, and by the way, as far as the slides go, I'm going to, at the end of my talk, I'll run through some pictures. But primarily, I'm going to speak without the slides. We don't really have an energy independence problem because we don't really import any of our electricity. What we have is an oil independence problem, which is that we depend for 99% of our transportation needs on oil, and we're importing close to 70% of that oil today. And that's where Better Place is focused. And as I go through later on, I'll describe how this dovetails with the other issue that we're trying to solve, which is the carbon problem, which is not helped by the fact that we are energy independent for electricity because of all of the use of coal and other carbon-emitting forms of electricity. But the founding question for Better Place was actually, how do you run a country without oil? And that was and there were three criteria that our founder, Shai Agassi, set when he set out to answer that question. He said it had to be something that was driven by the market, not by an edict, which obviously wouldn't work, wouldn't be sustainable. It had to be scalable. So it had to be something that actually could go to be adopted by everybody. And it had to not involve new science, new experiments, new technologies that might come out sometime in the future, because that's really the way that we've dealt with this problem for the last 40 or 50 years. We've said, well, we're just a few years away from hydrogen, or a few years away from the magical cellulosic ethanol that is going to solve all of our oil dependence problems. So with that set of criteria, what Shai discovered was that the only thing that actually met them was electrification. So the question is, how do you move to electrification of transportation? And here the thesis was, if you could create a car that was more convenient than what people are accustomed to today, and you could make that car less expensive, then people would choose that car and they would pay the same thing that they're paying now on an ongoing operating basis. So how do you make an electric car more convenient than people's experience today? And the answer is in infrastructure. The answer is in extending the electricity grid, which Michael's doing so much interesting work on, and extending that to the parking lot, to the place where your car sleeps, where your car is when you're working, when you're at retail, when you're downtown. Wherever your car is, you should have the ability to plug it in. If you did that with today's technology, every time you came back to your car, you'd have a 100-mile range. It's like you were being followed around. You got a contract with Chevron, and there's a guy who comes and tops you off every time you park. So that actually makes it more convenient, because 90+% of the time, you're not going to go 100 miles in your next leg. So you never have to stop for your energy. You're just plugging the car as you get out. I do that today. I'm lucky enough to be part of a program run by Mini. That's a one-year experimental lease for consumers on all-electric Mini. And that's been my experience for the last 4 months driving that car. I haven't been to a gas station. The second part of it is, what if you want to go the 100-plus mile trip? You want to drive from here to New York. And we had to answer that question, because even though it is the exceptional trip, people aren't going to buy a car without that ability. So the answer to that is, what's the fastest way to get the electrons necessary into the car? And what we discovered is the best way to do that is actually by switching out the whole battery. By pulling into a station and robotically having the depleted battery come out, get recharged for a future car, and have a ready, fully charged battery get put into the car. We were told that this couldn't be done, but we found some engineers who were up to the task, and in fact, earlier this year in Japan, with the Japanese government's money, we demonstrated that it could be done. I don't have the video here, but it takes about 45, 50 seconds to watch on our website at betterplace.com if you're interested in seeing it. And now we're engaged in another program in Japan where we'll be demonstrating how this works in taxi cabs going between downtown and the airport early next year. The other interesting thing, because the other thing we had to do was figure out how you make the electric car less expensive for consumers. As you know, electric cars today are at a big premium. And the answer to that is most of the excess cost comes from the battery. So if we're switching the battery out, we have to figure out what the nature of that battery is. And the nature of that battery is the critical question, because it's been seen until now as a component of the car. But what in fact it is economically it's the equivalent of crude oil. It's a consumable. It's something that each time you drive, you use a little bit of it. And so it's really naturally part of the energy infrastructure. So Better Place actually buys all of the batteries and buys the electricity, sets up the infrastructure, and then sells miles to consumers. We've been analogized a lot to cell phone companies where they put infrastructure and you buy minutes from them. And that's not a bad analogy, but what we found recently is that we're actually closer to what people are used to today, because people are used to paying a certain amount for a car and then paying an operating cost every week or every few weeks. So to pay a monthly fee for your miles is really what people are accustomed to doing today. When you go to the gas station, you're really buying your next 300 miles. It's like a prepaid calling card in that sense. And we'll have different programs by which people can buy miles, including the Metro PCS plan, buy all the miles, pay one fee and drive all the miles that you want. And so we're setting up this infrastructure today in Israel and in Denmark, soon to be setting up in Australia, and we've made announcements also in the Bay Area of California and Hawaii, which we are working on a strategy to execute on. We also have a car-making partner in this, which is Renault. We actually announced last month in Frankfurt that we've signed a contract with Renault to buy 100,000 battery switch sedans, and they debuted this sedan. They're midway through their 4-year production cycle, and they demonstrated it in Frankfurt. It's a 5-passenger luxury sedan, and it will be in the market in Israel and Denmark 2 years from now, in 2011. It's the first time, it's the largest order ever placed, as far as we know, for a non-gas consuming vehicle. And so we're very proud of that. And really, 2 years ago when we started talking about this, we were effectively competing against other alternatives to oil, hydrogen, biofuels, and so forth. Today, what we're finding is that there is a general consensus in the industry, among governments, that electrification is primarily the future. And what we're competing against is different modes of range extension. If you read about the Chevy Volt, the concept there is that the way that you extend the range when you have to go on a longer trip is you keep an engine in the trunk that charges the battery. And there are other programs that believe in fast charge, which is that there'll be infrastructure where you can plug in for a half an hour and get about 70 miles. We think that battery switch is the best mode of range extension, and separation of the battery for the ownership purposes is what will economically make the car less expensive and will encourage mass adoption. And so that's what we're going with. But it's interesting how this evolution has taken place very quickly towards electrification as a solution. One of the big concerns that I have personally, as I see these policies get set around the world, is that the U.S. is lagging. We start with an internal disadvantage, which is that when Better Place is selling our miles, the competing product is gasoline. And as you know, gasoline is cheaper in the U.S. than almost anywhere else. So in Israel, for example, the average consumer is paying between 30 and 40 cents for each mile, depending on the efficiency of the car, the price of gas exactly at that time. In the U.S., we're paying about a third of that. Our costs, by the way, are about 8 cents a mile, on electric. It's about 6 cents on battery depreciation and 2 cents of electricity. And as the batteries have longer lives, as we're seeing they do each cycle, the 8 cents goes down over time. But for the US, because it's less attractive from a margin point of view, there's less incentive for private companies to come and build the infrastructure here. And that's why it's easier to do it elsewhere. It's why we're starting in countries that have high gas prices. And that's a problem that really we need policy to fix. Obviously, everyone thinks of gas tax, but we all know that that's not something that's in the offing. And in fact, it's probably not even the best way to approach it. If we had more time, it might be. But we think that reducing the cost of capital on all elements of the solution is what needs to be done. And it's been done to some extent. You need 3 elements. You need, I call them A, B, and C: automobiles, batteries, and charge network. So we've put money out there for the car companies to switch to advanced technology vehicles, and some of that has already been accessed. We've also put a lot of money out there for U.S. battery manufacturers to stand up in the U.S., and the good news is that in Michigan there will be millions of batteries coming off assembly lines in 2 or 3 years. But the question is, where are those batteries going to go? And my fear right now is that they're not going to go into cars that are made in America, and they're not going to stay in America. They're going to go to Europe to displace much more expensive gasoline. And part of the reason, the major reason, I think, is because we haven't yet focused on the third element, the C, which is the charge network. You need to have that infrastructure in place if you're going to give consumers the peace of mind that they're going to be able to have a seamless experience in an electric car. There's been a certain number of consumers, it's actually a fairly large number, I think, where there's a lot of pent-up demand, and the competition to get into this mini program was fierce. I'm sure as the first electric cars come on, they'll get gobbled up by early adopters. But we're talking about mass adoption, and people wouldn't buy a cell phone if there wasn't towers to support it. They wouldn't buy gas cars if there weren't gas stations, and we need to put that infrastructure in place, and the government really has to help, particularly if the U.S. is going to compete in what we think is going to be the biggest industry in the 21st century, which is the combination of cars and the infrastructure for the cars. And finally, we're talking about the grid, we're talking about renewables, and how does it all fit into that? First of all, so no one should think that we are simply moving emissions from the tailpipe to the smokestack. Better Place is publicly committed to signing long-term power purchase agreements with utilities to buy renewable electricity, even at a premium. And we're able to do that because of the margins that I described. But more than that, if you look at Denmark, for example, where they get a huge proportion of their electricity from wind, more than any other country, they still are leaving a lot on the table. The reason is they get their wind at night when there isn't demand and they don't have the ability to store it, so they pay the Germans to take those wind electrons off their hands. When the Better Place network is in place, and these cars are plugged on average 22 hours a day, almost all of them plugged overnight, what you end up with is a network that can accept those wind electrons overnight and can essentially TiVo the electrons, so they can then call on them during the day. And car batteries are the natural marriage for wind or for solar or any intermittent electricity, because you need them to drive the cars anyway, and once they're out there in mass numbers and connected to this network that we're building with a control center, they can be the storage for those intermittent electrons, we think, causing a massive stimulus in private investment in those types of electricity sources. So we see an opportunity for the U.S. really in creating jobs through building out this infrastructure, in revitalizing the car industry, in ending our dependence on oil, and in reducing carbon by a huge amount by taking the tailpipes off the road and by creating this storage for clean electrons. So we think that this could be, one of the most exciting projects for the next few years, and we hope to work with the U.S. to see it happen in a way that, in a size that's commensurate with the opportunity. I'll just run through a few pictures for you now. Essentially, what you're looking at here is the old infrastructure for cars and what we think will be the new one, with the renewable electricity, the charge spots, the battery switch, and the consumer aspect, which enables the consumer to know all the information about their car and its energy situation. This is effectively what the integrated solution looks like. And here's a close-up on our charge spot, which actually has already won an industrial design award. We have about 1,000 of these already on the streets and parking lots of Israel. Those are being tested, and we'll have next year going to 100,000 before the first cars arrive in 2011. And here are some examples where you can see it's in parking lots. This is a street in Jerusalem. This is a parking garage and a home garage. This is one image of a battery switch station. As I said, you can watch the video, which is pretty fascinating, on our website. Here's some concepts of where you could actually put the battery switch. Gas stations are a natural that everybody thinks about, but you can actually put them in urban parking garages. You can put them in a cab line outside a hotel or in an airport, and we think that's what's going to happen. They're not a very large footprint. And then there's the integrated consumer end of this that you integrate your navigation with your energy services with customer support that's always there, so that the consumer always never has range anxiety. They always know where they're going to be able to charge the car, if they're not going to get to a charge spot in time, where they can switch the battery, and how to get there. So that's effectively what solution looks like. Here are the countries that we're operating in, and looking forward to conversation later on.